The way the Federal Reserve manages the U.S. economy, and believe me, in the end, it's the Federal Reserve that matters. Well, let me back up and try to explain. The U.S. economy has an underlying engine of economic growth that, left unimpeded, would result in continuous, steady growth, driven by growth in the working population and productivity gains. It takes the Federal Reserve to cause a slowdown or a recession. Let me repeat that. The economy doesn't spontaneously fall into recession all by itself. Left unimpeded by monetary policy, the economy would do this on a straight, steady basis over the long term, driven by those underlying growth drivers. It takes the Federal Reserve to flatten or invert the yield curve in order to create a recession. Why does it work that way? What you're looking at here is the basic term structure of interest rates. Short-term interest rates out to the 30-year bond yield. Here's how it works. The only way that you can have continuous growth in any economy is with a continued supply of new money, M2, to fund an increased volume of transactions on the part of households and businesses. The amount in savings, checkings, money market account, the definition of M2, has to continuously grow in order to fund a continuous expansion of the U.S. economy. In other words, it takes banks making new loans all the time to fund economic growth. Banks will only make new loans when they have incentive to do so. When banks' cost of funds is less than what they can charge for those loans, they're happy to push money out the door. Today, in reality, a bank might pay you 50 basis points on a CD, if that, and make a car loan at 4 or 5%. You with me? The shape of the yield curve is everything. The shape of the yield curve. It's not the absolute level of bond yields, which I'll get to later. By March of 2007, the Fed had so ratcheted higher short-term interest rates that they inverted the yield curve. And look what happened. March of 2007, in this chart, is right here. And what followed immediately thereafter? Recession. In fact, recession, 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 following inverted yield curve here, here, and here. The Fed hasn't deliberately created recession, but they've wanted to slow the rate of economic expansion because they got worried about inflation. And they ended up tipping it over into recession every single time. This is remarkable to me. It confirms what I was saying earlier. Left unimpeded, the economy would do this. The Federal Reserve has created every single recession post-World War II. This chart goes back to 1983. You can take the data back to 1954, and you'll see exactly the same thing. We've never had a recession in the United States post-World War II that the Fed hasn't been responsible for. Okay? What does it mean today? What it means today is that we are nowhere near a flat or inverted yield curve. That's the important takeaway from this chart. People saying, well, the Fed's, you get the heebie-jeebies every other day in the stock market, saying, well, will it be 3 rate hikes or 4 rate hikes this year? That's nonsense. The Fed's going to have to invert the yield curve in order to create a recession. We'd have to go from 1.4 to 3% today to flatten or invert the yield curve. But the Fed says, they have told us it's going to be slow and steady. 3 or 4, I don't care this year. That's not the important thing. What matters is the shape of the yield curve and how's this going to play out. Today we have a relatively steep yield curve. We're nowhere near the Fed causing recession. Another reason to believe, at least in my view, that the stock market probably continues along for some additional period of time. So here I have superimposed the stock market on that very same chart. The Fed creates an inverted yield curve. It has led to recession, and stocks, as they always do, anticipate an economic slowdown or a contraction. Stocks roll over and you get a bear market in stocks. But without this being close to here, I'm not concerned about a bear market in stocks for the time being. Make sense? All right, back to the Federal Reserve. If you took literally this notion that the Fed's going to push short-term rates from 1.253 to 3% over the next year and a half, then that would suggest a flat yield curve, and you'd be right on the brink of recession, right? But that doesn't take into consideration what happens on the long end of the yield curve. In other words, bond yields. Just in the last 6 months, bond yields have moved farther than short-term rates. In other words, the whole yield curve is moving up, and it's actually steepened. My point earlier was a steeper yield curve is actually stimulative to the U.S. economy. In other words, the Fed has told us they're going to do this. People say, well, that'll cause a recession, and I say, not so fast, because bond yields are being artificially held down by quantitative easing, first by the Federal Reserve and now the European Central Bank. That's about to end. I think bond yields also head higher, and they have already started to do so, suggesting this whole curve is the most likely path, at least in my mind, is the whole curve doing this. And that is actually positive for the U.S. economy, not negative.